Hello and welcome back to the Live from the Wrist podcast. There's been some interesting stories that have come out in the watch world over the last couple of weeks. I know we've been missing a little bit, but trying to get back on the sort of regular weekly schedule that we had before. We're going to talk about some of the stories and then go over some vintage watches that we're going to be covering on lifethenewrist.com, as we always do when we get some new pieces in, just to sort of give you some interest in some of the things that we're going to be covering on the channel. I think one of the biggest pieces of news that happened this month was the fact that it was announced that Watches of Switzerland would be acquiring Hodinkee. This is a very big story because Hodinkee is obviously one of the most important journalism companies in my opinion, in the entire watch industry. They really started a lot of the interest that we have in watches really comes from what Hodinkee and Ben Clymer built. And so this is a very, very big piece of news to come out. It was quite interesting because this does come on the tails of Hodinkee getting a fairly large amount in venture capital and also acquiring Crown and Caliber. So they were really moving to grow the organization as a whole. I think the acquisition of Crown and Caliber and a lot of the venture capital that they received was in an effort to grow their business, especially on the sort of retail side of things, selling some of their watches, selling watches on the secondary and primary markets was really what they were focusing on, given the amount of interest that there was sort of back in the early 2020s in the watch industry. I think we all know the story that things have kind of not kept up with the incredible pace that things were moving in back then, and I think there's obviously been a contraction in a lot of sort of the hype around watch collecting, watch interest. So that was sort of where their growth came from, and then it was announced that there was this acquisition by Watches of Switzerland of Hodinkee, and it's not disclosed, but many people believe that it was for a lower amount than the original valuation that Hodinkee had when they received the investments that they did in the early 2020s, which is a pretty big bit of news. You'd hope, especially as shareholders, you would hope that the acquisition by Watches of Switzerland would have been for at least at or above the original valuation price. This is a pretty interesting step because obviously a lot of people now will question where the direction of Hodinkee will go. Will it be sort of an outlet for Watches of Switzerland to basically have their own sort of media and journalism company that they will publish news articles about sort of their watches and sort of talk about their own priorities, or will Hodinkee remain independent and continue to publish things that are, as an independent journalism company? It's really difficult to say. I think it's a good example of continued contraction and compression in the industry. You can think about deals like the Rolex and Bucher deal. You can think about the fact that, and this was just published, I think the European watch company acquired Crown and Caliber, which is a pretty big step, really changes the direction of what Hodinkee really was and what it was going to be. So this is definitely an example of contraction in the market. And you see this with a lot of industries, right? I think you can think about it in banking. Recessions often lead to the contraction of companies in a given industry, especially during times of hardship. And I think that's what the watch industry is going through right now. And Hodinkee was sort of stepping into sort of the watch retail world, and things definitely changed a lot over the last couple of years. I do find it quite interesting, though, when you think about the skill sets now that Hodinkee brings. Obviously, they're a media company, but then they also have Hodinkee Insurance, which I've seen a lot about. If you think about, I think Hodinkee Insurance is going to be at Watch Time. That happened this past weekend, if you're listening to this, but I think they're going to be at Watch Time in New York. So it's very interesting now to think about Hodinkee and sort of the skill sets that they have as an organization. But I think this is a big bit of news. One of the other things that sort of came with this is that Ben Clymer is going to be stepping back into the organization and really spearheading a lot of the efforts for the organization, which I think is quite interesting. He's going to be the president, or he describes it as he's going to be the president and primary decision maker. So for those Ben Clymer fans, it will be cool to see him back in action. We'll put a bow on that. I think it's been covered pretty heavily. There's interesting articles out there to read and get the opinions of watch enthusiasts and get their thoughts on really this pretty momentous change for Hodinkee. It's a pretty big shift, especially because I bet that those of you who are into watches now, I bet you that Hodinkee was a big part of you getting into them. I apologize for the pauses in the way in which I'm presenting that topic. I know that I've received some feedback on that, so apologies for that, but hopefully I give you a little bit of information and my opinions on it, we try to keep things casual here. I think the next big bit of news is the Patek Philippe Cubitus collection that was released. This is a pretty interesting shift for Patek Philippe. So it was leaked that this new watch was going to be released by Patek Philippe, and it is named the Cubitus. And what they've essentially done, and I'm going to put it in layman's terms, what they've essentially done is they've taken the Nautilus, they've made it look more like a square, and then repurposed the bracelets, the dials, the hands, and really the overall design of these watches. It's a pretty divisive piece, I'll say. There's a couple of references that they released. They have the 5821A, which is a steel Cubitus with a green dial. They also have the 5821-1AR, which is a stainless steel and rose gold case and dialed piece with a blue dial and time and date complication. And then they've got a platinum blue dial with an instantaneous grand date, day, and moon phase in the reference 5822P. These pieces are pretty divisive, as I mentioned. I think it's going to take someone who enjoys sort of this aesthetic, this shape in watches, to probably be interested in purchasing one of these. It does obviously build off of the success that they've had with the Nautilus, and is quite an interesting step for the brand. One of the things that I'm trying to do is compare it to a brand of similar caliber, and how they have sort of diversified their lineup of watches, because I think what the purpose of this Cubitus is to show that Patek Philippe isn't all about the when it comes to sports watches, they're not all about the Nautilus. And I think a very easy comparison to make is to the Audemars Piguet Code 1159. The differences that I see is the Code 1159 was really taking a completely different direction than the Royal Oak, for example. They really made a completely different case, different dial layout, different dial aesthetics, and tried to create something that was truly different than the Royal Oak. When I look at the Cubitus, it has a lot of the design aesthetics and a lot of very similar motifs to that of the Nautilus. Sure, it has a very different sort of case design. It's going to fit very, very differently on the wrist, I would imagine. But it is very, very similar to the watch that maybe they're trying to diversify away from. The Code 1159, when it was released, though, got probably as much negative news as it did positive. One of the things that Audemars Piguet did very, very well, though, was react to some of those the negative feedback that they got by coming up with ways in which they could improve their watches and coming up with complications that would be interesting to collectors. And so it's not like this watch is going to be the end of Patek Philippe. I would imagine that Patek Philippe will likely react similarly. Maybe they'll come out with something a little bit different. But it is very difficult when the basis of your release is essentially the exact same, is very, very similar to that of the Nautilus, which you're trying to diversify away, because it would be kind of strange for them to start with this piece and then come out with a completely new dial design, for example, or come out with a new bracelet for this piece. It's a lot harder to shift to something like that when you have this sort of original design that you've come out with. In a way, Audemars Piguet sort of had a blank canvas. They came out with something that would allow them some sort of freedom away from sort of this original design that they've come out with, because it doesn't look like anything in the Audemars Piguet lineup. So a very interesting move from the brand. I will say there's also been some feedback about the pricing of these pieces. You know, I'm not one to. I actually am not well versed in how modern brands typically do pricing of pieces. It's just not something that I specialize in. And so I probably can't speak to that side of things. But there was, sorry for the pause there, just for some reason my recording device was being a little bit strange. But anyway, the interesting facts about the pricing of these pieces is that they are priced pretty aggressively. I think the Perpetual Calendar is priced, let me go down to the pricing of these pieces. If I look at the first watch that I spoke about, which is the 5821-1A, the stainless steel green dial time and date complication piece, it's priced at 41,000 US dollars, which is pretty aggressive for a time and date complicated piece. The two-tone is priced at 61,000, and then the platinum version that I spoke about at the end is priced at 88,000 US dollars. These are pretty aggressive prices, but hey, if there's demand for it, I'm sure that Patek Philippe demonstrated that there would be demand for these pieces and were able to price them at the prices that they chose. So, yeah, quite a controversial topic. Social media was crazy with these pieces. Very interesting to get people's opinions. I had a bunch of people texting me about what I thought about it, so hopefully this gives you a summary of what I'm thinking about it. Some of the opinions that I got were it's a money grab. It's no different than the Nautilus. It's just repurposing and trying to come up with new designs. Another sort of side that I heard was it looks very much like a Bell & Ross. It looks like something that someone modded. But then I got other the completely opposite opinions as well, where people said it's interesting to now have, for the longest time now, we've kind of been stuck in the sort of the Royal Oak Nautilus case designs, and maybe what Patek Philippe is trying to do here is move us beyond sort of that design, that similar aesthetic that we've had for so long, and maybe try and innovate in some way when it comes to the case design of these pieces. And I think that's a completely fair point. Maybe it's an attempt to say the Nautilus Royal Oak porthole design has run its course, and we want to come up with something that maybe is a modern take on what this could look like, while keeping a lot of the elements that collectors like a lot, which is a very, very similar dial, a very, very similar bracelet, but really come up with something that looks a little bit different. I think that's a completely valid point, and I had a very interesting conversation with someone about that, in saying that, you know, at some point, the Royal Oak and the Nautilus came out, and it was a completely different sort of design to many people. And maybe this is an attempt to sort of move us to a completely new design that might be of interest to collectors. And when it comes from a brand like Patek Philippe, you kind of want to, you know, not give them the benefit of the doubt, but at least acknowledge it and try and understand why they did something like this to their lineup of watches. So we'll see what happens. We will see what happens. The last thing I wanted to mention was the, I know we spoke about it, I think, in one of our previous podcasts, but when you're listening to this podcast, the Monaco Legend auction that is taking place in Monaco on the 19th and 20th, which is this past weekend, will have taken place. I have posted a couple of the watches that I really like on the Life on the Wrist Instagram page. If you want to take a look at those, I highly recommend you to do that. I'll put a link in the description to the auction so you can see the lots, as well as at the time that you're probably going to be listening to this, the results for the pieces. I think that's something that will be kind of cool to do. I called out a couple of really cool pieces on our Instagram page. I'll call out a couple here that, just while I'm scrolling sort of through the catalog, there was a really, really cool Bucher Rolex desk clock in silver with a really beautiful enamel painting of an individual playing golf on the front of it. It's such a cool piece, and so unique. It's also got this sort of Bucher Rolex context that it resonates with me quite nicely, and just something a little bit different than, you know, your average watch that you're going to find at a watch auction. One of the other pieces that I thought was quite interesting and was, it's a staple of a collection, is lot number 48, which is a really beautiful pink gold reference reference 533 from Patek Philippe. Really beautiful pink gold chronograph example from 1942. These are extremely rare watches. Approximately 350 pieces were made, and there were very, very few of them that were made in pink gold. It's a beautiful example, and it's a pink on pink as well, so you have a pink dial and a pink case, which I think is makes it exceptionally beautiful. Maybe I'll call out just a couple more that I thought were quite interesting. There's a really nice Omega that was the property of the Spanish noble family, the Roca family, with a beautiful enamel dial and the Roca name on the front of it. I think that's a really incredible example. There are a lot of enamel dial pieces in this auction. I encourage you to check it out. I'll end on a watch that is one of my favorites, and that's a reference 4737 from Vacheron Constantin Cioccolatone, model from 1960. Beautiful example, triple-stepped case. You can't get much better than this, in my opinion. It's one of my absolute favorite models from any watch brand. I've covered it excessively on Life on the Wrist. Anyway, I'll leave a link in the description for you to see the lots, and you'll be able to see the results as well. There are incredible pieces, as always, with Monaco Legend Group, and so I encourage you to do that. One other thing that I wanted to just mention is an article that was released by Perescope, who sort of does investigative journalism into a lot of the watches that come to the auction market. There was a piece that he published on October 16th about some of the Daytonas that are being sold at the Monaco auction. I encourage you just to read it. It's really more to make sure that you're educated in some of the things that, Perescope is looking at when he's going through auction catalogs. I think it is an example of just making sure that you do your homework when you're purchasing watches, and building up the knowledge that you have when looking at watches at auction, and just buying watches in general. I think is it's a super important skill that I think he demonstrates really well, and you can also begin to practice as you go through your watchmaking journey. So I'll leave a link in the description to that article. All right, next up, there are 4 vintage watches that we're going to be covering on the channel. You probably have seen, actually no, by the time you've seen this, you'll only have seen a comparison of 2 of the watches that we're going to be talking about, but I'll go through all 4 of them as they will be coming up on the channel. The first watch I wanted to talk about is an incredibly beautiful IWC automatic, time only in steel. The reason why I wanted to cover this piece is I'd say about a year ago, we covered a really beautiful rose gold example from IWC with a manual wind caliber 89 movement in it. And one of the things that really stood out about that piece is the fact that it had incredibly beautiful Bombay twisted lugs. And we were able to find a steel version of an IWC with the same lug design. This watch was manufactured in 1950 and comes in a 35 millimeter case that's made out of Stay Bright steel, which is a steel alloy. As I mentioned, the lugs are really where this watch stands out with their Bombay design that's often called sort of twisted lugs by collectors. The lugs are really long, so it makes this 35 millimeter case actually sit quite large on the wrist. It has a beautiful white dial that has sort of this cream tone to it with applied hour markers. And then it has these sword hands, and what's kind of cool if you're into that is that the luminescent material on the inside of the the minutes hand is missing, so it kind of gives it a little bit of a aged feel to it there. It has a cursive IWC name printed on the dial and runs on the caliber 85 automatic movement, which is an extremely important movement for IWC. There were about 8,000 movements, or a little over 8,000 movements that were produced by IWC of the caliber 85, and it's the second automatic movement that IWC produced after the caliber 81. And I don't think the caliber 81 was actually serially produced. What's really cool about this movement, it's actually signed with patent applied, which indicates it's one of the earlier versions of the caliber 85, and puts it really at the genesis of a very important movement for IWC, I think, and obviously paved the way for a lot of the, what came from the brand as the brand moved forward. So this is a really beautiful piece. It's one of the, for some reason, I just love the case designs and the lug designs of these pieces that IWC produced during this era. I think the rose gold version was from the late 40s, this one being from the 50s, so it's very, very close by. One of the things I love about this piece is actually the condition. I found the rose gold version, and I mentioned this, when we covered it, is there was definitely some polishing that one could see on this piece. The lugs were a little bit softer, but I find that this steel version is truly in really nice condition, less polishing than the rose gold example, and I think it allows you to enjoy the twisted Bombay lugs a little bit more. So that's the first piece. We then have two Tudor Prince oyster dates, which you're going to see in a video. Actually, tomorrow, I'll give a little bit of a spoiler. Tomorrow, we're going to have a video where we discuss these oyster dates. But the first one is a reference 75203, which was manufactured in 1987. The watch has a stainless steel case that's in overall pretty good condition. Obviously, signs of polishing. What's really cool about this piece is it has an 18-karat gold fluted bezel, as well as a beautiful gold linen dial, which we've covered a couple watches with linen dials. It's really an exceptional example, really, really beautiful example of this. I paired it with this blue strap, which I think in contrast with the gold looks really nice. I'm a huge fan of sort of that gold and sort of dark blue combination. Obviously has a date complication and runs on the caliber 28-24 automatic movement. The video that we're going to do is going to kind of compare and contrast this to the other two that we're going to mention, but I think this watch really has a lot to say, and is for me, like if you're looking for an everyday watch or a watch that you can wear for the rest of your life, this is a perfect example of it. You've got something interesting with the linen dial, and a complication that is useful with a very classic design. The other watch that you're going to see in that video is going to be a Tudor Prince Oyster Date reference 74000. We've covered, I think, 2 this year of this same reference, but this one comes from 1984. It has a stainless steel case with a smooth steel bezel that I think is obviously very, very in contrast to the 75203 that we just spoke about. Very, very simplistic, very, very understated. If you look at the dial of this watch, it has a really beautiful white sunburst style that has really nice sort of freckled patina on it a little bit towards the center of where the hours and minutes hands are in the center of the dial. I think it looks really phenomenal. This watch also runs on the caliber 2824 automatic wind movements. I think it's a modified ETA movement that Tudor used. So another really beautiful example. And interesting to think is that these watches are 3 years apart. Kind of cool to have both of these pieces together. And I look forward to covering them in the video. Hope you enjoy it and hope you enjoy the article that we wrote about it. The last watch that we're going to talk about and the last topic for this podcast is a really beautiful Rolex that we got in. It's a Rolex Oyster Speed King reference 7430. This is a really interesting reference. It's a 30 millimeter. These Speed Kings are 30 millimeters in diameter, so they are on the smaller side and probably don't get a lot of the press just because of, they're only wearable to a certain portion of watch collectors, I'd say. But this watch was manufactured in 1954. It's a stainless steel cased watch in 30 millimeters and has a steel smooth bezel, very similar to the Tudor that we mentioned previously. There are, being from 1954, there are signs of wear on this watch. It's definitely lived its life, shows it in its case, as well as sort of the age dial that it has. It's really cool that this watch runs on the caliber 1210 manual wind movement from Rolex, and really we're going to cover this on the channel, but what's really interesting about the Speed King is sort of the historical figure that this watch is sort of named after. Quite an interesting story. If you don't know it, stay tuned for our article about the Speed King. Another really cool, interesting fact about these pieces is I think this watch, especially in the advertising that Rolex did, I think it demonstrated Rolex's competitive advantage was not just designing pieces with really incredible watchmaking technology, like an Oyster case, like a precision movement, but it also had to do with the way in which they marketed their watches. And if you are interested in marketing, or you want to know more about Rolex as a brand and how they built their brand, look at their marketing history, because the Speed King, I think, showcases that quite well, like many other models from Rolex, but I think it showcases it very, very well. I want to thank you for listening to this podcast. As always, there will be links in the show notes of this podcast to all the topics that we discussed. So if you want to read about some of these pieces that we've discussed or take a look at the articles that we've mentioned, there will be links in the show notes of this podcast. I want to apologize if it seems like I'm a little bit out of practice when it comes to recording podcasts. There was some technical difficulties at the beginning, and then also I think just the way in which I speak about these topics was a little bit out of practice. So apologies, but looking forward to the next one where hopefully I'll get my groove back. If you are new to the Life on the Wrist podcast, be sure to follow us so you are notified when we upload one of our episodes. If you are new to Life on the Wrist in general, be sure to head over to our website and you can check out our social medias where we cover all things vintage watches. It's really a passion and hopefully you can enjoy them with us. If you wouldn't mind sharing this podcast with a friend, and if you wouldn't mind liking and, rating this podcast, your feedback is really, really important to me so we can continue to adapt and make sure this podcast is as enjoyable to you as possible. With that said, guys, thank you so much for listening to this podcast, and until next time.